All right, thank you very much for being here today. We're going to open the first session, which I think is going to help give us a lot of context for discussions that are going to be going on the rest of the day. Looking more broadly at issues of water security and the involvement of women in that in the region. And we have 4 speakers. I'm going to try to keep them to about 15 minutes each, so we can save time for questions. And we're going to start with Marcus King, who's the head of the International Affairs Program here at GW, and he's going to be talking broadly about water security in the context of climate change. And then we'll move over to Central Asia, of Marlene Laurel, who will be speaking about the over-securitization of water issues in Central Asia. And then we'll move over to South Asia, on my left here. Deepa Alapali will be speaking about South Asian narratives on water and security. And Barbara Miller will be speaking about vital connections, women, water, and food in the region. And so if we can start right in, since we're a little bit behind already. So.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here at the culmination of the project. As was alluded to earlier, I had seen it sort of at its inception in the context of another project I was working on here at the Elliott School on American leadership in the water sector. So at that time, I was able to coordinate with Ariana and others and really see this at the birth. So it's exciting to see the culmination of it. So at risk of talking about maybe what would be the over-securitization of water, and I'll be a good balance to Marlene, I want to talk about some of the challenges that we're currently facing related to environmental degradation in water, including climate change currently, and then what some of these changes might evolve into in the next, particularly the next 15 years. So the work that I did in this whole project I had mentioned on American leadership was animated by the findings of an intelligence community assessment coordinated by 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, but commissioned by Maria Otero, who was then Undersecretary of State for what included in energy and environment. So that was sort of my research agenda, jumping off from what these findings were. So quickly I wanted to speak about water security, what the definition is. This was a synthetic definition developed by UN Water a few years ago, coincident with the General Assembly, and that's purely the capacity of a population to safeguard access to adequate quantities and acceptable quality of water for sustaining livelihood, ensuring protection against pollution and water-related disasters, and preserving the ecosystem for peace and political stability. But I wanted to emphasize that water security has essentially 2 components. One would be water stress and the other water scarcity. Mostly we think about water scarcity, but I wanted to also emphasize some other elements of the definition. So quantity, availability, the quality, how much it's polluted, the biological characteristics of water for different uses, and of course the availability, which would be actually defined as the capacity of the water source to meet the specific use, not necessarily quantity. Whereas water scarcity itself relates to quantity, what they would call the volumetric availability of water, not the quality of the water itself. So I wanted to speak about some of the current environmental challenges related to water growth and water issues. So to do so, I wanted to look at the world baseline of water stress. So again, this is a larger concept than just water scarcity. This work comes from World Resources Council Aqueduct program, which currently has the best data globally on these issues. So essentially, you can see that the water stress, which is extremely high here in the red, water stress globally is pretty much centered on the equator right now. So it's a little bit of an equatorial issue, but you can see that equator with the radius going north and south from there, sorry, the distance going north and south does encompass almost all of the region in question that we're speaking about today. Interestingly, it's all of Southwest Asia, all of South Asia, and much of Central Asia. So this is the current conditions where there's extremely high water stress in the red areas. Interesting diversion is look at how bad the problem really is in the western United States. So we're essentially sitting on a time bomb here in the United States because we've got the worst drought in instrumental record out in California, contributing to our problems. So we have a lot to learn, obviously, on the local level here in the United States. So the majority of people actually live in water basins. The basin's an area that contributes hydrologically, both with surface and groundwater, to a primary stream, and that primary stream then empties into a larger body of water, such as the ocean. So that's the technical definition of a basin. And what I have here on this map, also from Aqueduct, is water stressed by the most popular basins, river basins. So by 2050, human-induced climate change will affect every basin on the planet. Half the people in the world will be living in areas of high water stress. 145 nations fall within basins, and 33 countries are located entirely within a basin. So the basin areas are really the locus of potential conflict, and where water sharing has been very important historically, and water sharing has been the historical norm over the last 4,500 years. Basins have been what's characterized basins has been cooperation among the actors, not competition and not conflict. So the Indus River Treaty, for example, is a good example of that, where Pakistan and India, since after the early 50s, have been belligerents on a lot of levels, different scales of conflict, both verbal and physical. But always there's been an agreement that's been adhered to on the sharing of the waters in the Indus Basin. So you can see that water cooperation has transcended political differences, and that, unfortunately, I believe is likely to change. So just looking at some regional impacts of climate change on Asia, these are the principal ways currently that climate change is impacting on the region. So the first is droughts. There's regional agricultural productivity reduction in the arid zones. So most of, again, all the countries we're talking about are considered in the arid zones. Surprisingly, sea level rise brought about by temperature increase actually creates what's called saline intrusion into freshwater supplies. And this is a very big problem in Bangladesh, which actually has existential issues with flooding, but it's also the spoiling of the water supplies due to saline intrusion. There's something called the Low Elevation Coastal Zone, the LECZ. So that's an area that's 10 meters or less above sea level within a nation. And so we expect by the end of the century that there will be, 10 feet. So by the end of the century, we're expecting a 1 meter sea level rise. So that will entirely inundate the low elevation coastal zone, but also the rest of those areas will be affected. So 40% of the population in Asia as a whole lives in this low elevation coastal zone. Another example of temperature increase besides sea level rise is the idea of the glaciers melting. So glaciers melting in the Himalayas and the Andes at first will cause flooding for the first few years, such as the severity of the flooding we've seen in Nepal, but after that will actually cause scarcity. There'll be less fresh water fed into the river systems that are originating in the Himalayas. Also, there's extreme weather events. There's some scientific disagreement about whether extreme weather is actually being caused by climate change, but that's not the question for us to address because the impacts are observable. We understand that extreme weather is more frequent and intense, and one way this has manifested itself particularly is more frequent cyclones in Asia. So those were the current challenges facing the global water system and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the future challenges, especially with regard to climate change. So these are the two maps that represent different scenarios of basically how much energy and how many pollutants, greenhouse gases, will be emitted under different scenarios. So this RCP 2.6 is a more optimistic scenario on the top. 8.5 is a less optimistic scenario about continued usage of energy that creates more greenhouse gases. So you can see that 1986 to 2005 baseline, moving that out to 2080 to the end of the century, the actual temperature rise in these models would be up to 11 degrees Celsius, which I believe is about 13 degrees Fahrenheit. So the amount of sea level rise, again, resulting from something like this could be up to 1 meter. And then also we're looking at the lower one, the second set of maps here, that's changes in average precipitation. So you can see it's cut off a little bit, but the changes in precipitation in places that are already dry won't be as great. But again, if you look at the equatorial issue here, there's actually a big increase in participation around the mid-latitudes. And so it's a mixed picture. Sometimes increased precipitation is going to be great for agriculture. Other times it can cause flooding, like the flooding we saw in Pakistan in the last few years and the social disruptions related to that flooding. But it is a mixed picture. In some areas there'll be increased precipitation right below the Sahel in Middle Africa there and in Central Africa. Agricultural conditions will actually improve. But these are what the regional climate models, I should have said, by the IPCC UN system, the ones that they've created. So this is just looking more carefully for a moment at the global average surface temperatures, but out to 2090, and this is again one of the worst cases. So again, it's interesting, I think, that the United States is going to warm at a higher average rate, and you can see that the highest warming is in the Arctic, and we're already noticing the melting of the ice caps. And the ice caps are melting so quickly that it's changing what the assumptions would be. It's a nonlinear rate of melting that's really changing the idea that sea level rise is going to be worsened by the Arctic glacial ice sheets melting much more quickly. So when you're looking at a country and trying to assess the level of impacts of climate-induced water stress, there are two factors we sort of look at. One is exposure and one's resilience. This is based on a study that I did when I belonged to another organization, CNA Corporation. We were asked to do some follow-on work from this ICA community assessment I mentioned in 2012. So what we did is we looked at the exposure of countries, which is the climate stress faced by that country, and then tried to understand the resilience, which is the ability to cope or recover from this exposure. So quickly I wanted to say that exposure is, again, the temperature, it's the flood risk, it's the frequency of droughts, the absolute scarcity of water, and also sea level rise's impact on water supply. The resilience of a nation has to do with economic sensitivity, purely GDP as applied to water systems, which gets into the governance. Political stability obviously is a necessary component within a country to build resilience. And then human health here is it's shortened for human health systems. So the question is, how robust are national human health systems in countries that are experiencing this water stress? So this study that we did, we collected data from the World Bank, for example, on governance. Economic sensitivity was World Bank data. And then these impacts on the exposure side had more to do, again, with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their regional climate models and projections. So what we did is we mapped the exposure versus the resilience. And so the exposure here is the number of elements of water stress that we found within a given country. The years we're looking at is 2025 to 2030, so for, in the near term, and then we map that against the resilience scores that we developed using a model. And so we only looked at the countries that were the 40 most affected by water stress. So to be on this map at all, you're already in the area of the 40 most at-risk countries. So what we found is up here where Ethiopia is, that would be the highest exposure in the red. We call this the acute watch list of countries that we really had to basically worry about what the future would be without increased resilience. So in blue, I just added the countries that were relevant today to the work we did. And you can see Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and even India are very, India especially is high exposure with less resilience on a scale of 1 to 100. This is just the center. So the question is, how might this change? And the way that it might change is, for example, when we look at glacial melt, we looked out to 2040, and the biggest dynamic would probably be glacial melt. So Nepal and the Andean countries that rely on water from glaciers for supply, like Chile, Bolivia, we'd expect to then show up on this map by 2040. There are a couple countries not here. People always ask me why a particular country is not on the map. We didn't have data for the small island states, although they do face literally an existential threat from flooding from sea level rise. They're not on there. Yemen would probably be number 1 in terms of the acute watch list, but we didn't have data on Yemen because, getting back to a resilience factor, was there wasn't adequate political stability there to collect the data. So that's been a problem. So what were our findings? The findings were by 2040, freshwater availability would not keep up with demand, absent more effective management of water resources, certainly in all the countries that were in the yellow and the red. This was a US-funded study as well, so it was determined that many countries important to the United States interests would have shortages of poor water quality, also flooding, and this would risk instability in these countries, but also prevent countries from cooperation with each other, at least on the national level, as opposed to the more local level, which this work is an example of. So water problems will hinder the availability of key countries to produce food and energy, and there's this food, energy, water nexus that you hear so much about. I'll touch on again in a moment. So this was the water stress today, and I was talking about the future. So within this study, this again was going out to 2025. So this is just another map, this one produced by the US government with access to a little more hydrological data than we had. So this is a little more robust. And again, you can see that the areas that are in very dark red are expected to be exceptionally more water stressed by 2025 than today. So the epitome of that, it might be Yemen again, which might run out of exploitable water given their level of technology to get to that water, the sinking the aquifer to a point that there's some estimates that they could literally run out of exploitable water by 2040, particularly if there's not a political situation that would involve and enable the way building more adequate infrastructure to get to that water. So what are some of the security implications of this water stress? There are 4 principal pathways that impact on national security, and again, I was looking at the national level in the research that I do. So it's changes in water availability, which then really create this catalyst of migration. So migration is the biggest factor of instability. When there's changes in agricultural productivity, there's migration, frequently internal, damages to economically significant infrastructure, which might be from extreme weather or other climate impacts, also affect migration, and then changes in what they call disease vectors, which is basically the geographical distribution of diseases changes as species that carry diseases move to more temperate zones, for example. And also the quality of water itself, which isn't a climate impact, also changes disease vectors. So migration is not necessarily significant to state stability. Sometimes it's a planned adaptation response, sometimes it's beneficial, and that depends on the local circumstances. But migration is the catalyst that then can create instability within a state at its most extreme, leading to conflict. So getting to my work a little bit, I've been working on a multi-year project linking climate change, water, and conflict within areas that basically are of current security concern for the United States. So I did a book chapter where we looked at Nigeria, and what we found was, especially in northern Nigeria, there's a very complex causal relationship between how migration might have had to do with the instability that exists there. But what we did find is that the resilience of individual populations to attacks by groups like Boko Haram was very much reduced by the fact that they didn't have agricultural crop yields that were adequate. They weren't able to graze cattle to basically maintain health of the population, which made them more susceptible to not only disease but also attacks. So that was our basic frame for Nigeria. The work I did this summer was on climate, water, and conflict in Syria. And I have a paper coming out literally on the middle of next week in Washington Quarterly, which is sort of the policy summary of our findings, where we did some ground surveys and some other approaches. So what we found in Syria was there is this backdrop of climate-induced migration, which did bring people to the cities, created dislocation of people that had to live at the peripheries of the urban areas, sort of set the stage for some radicalization, which in fact was one of a complex web of drivers that led to the conflict there. And this all started at the first level with the changes in the physical environment, higher temperatures leading to droughts. Droughts were found to be 2 to 3 times more likely by climate change in a new study in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And then the ecological effects were the second level effects of climate change, desertification. Third level was the effect on the human systems. So the severe stress on agriculture, food insecurity was a driver of migration, again, to these northern cities in Syria that did not have conditions that supported social stability. Finally, in this case, the Assad regime's responses were inadequate in terms of the structure of water policy, which led again to local conflict and may have sparked something that became more regionally significant. So how do we meet the challenges? I know you'll speak more about this later in the session today, but meeting the challenges is something I've looked at, again, more on the national level in terms of national security. So, we find that water management, improved water management will afford the best solutions to water problems, and management solutions have to do with pricing, have to do with better allocation policy for water. PPPs are public-private partnerships. I think some of the organizations here are involved in PPPs. The idea of saving virtual water through trade policy. Countries should not be trading water-intensive products on the open market in the world when they actually could trade for those. Cotton in Uzbekistan's been an example of that for a long time. So it's the idea of relative terms of trade of countries trading things that are less water intensive, assuming they're experiencing water scarcity. And then foreign aid and investments, United States, USAID, investing in this infrastructure related to the provision of water. So infrastructure like improved irrigation techniques, power that doesn't rely on water, so less dams, for example, less reliance on hydropower, and also water treatment plants. So again, though, the focus has to be on the agricultural sector because 70% of global freshwater supply is used in the agricultural sector, so it's most significant for water scarcity. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to say that we've looked at the idea in the United States as a priority anyway of making water a global priority to support the legal institutions and agreements that can resolve water disputes, supporting major development projects. But one of the most important factors is actually technology sharing. So dissemination of satellite data that we might have, remote sensing capabilities, hydrological data. One of the reasons why I have focused on global issues is because The regional climate models are all focused on the regions. At most, they break down to Asia as a whole. But what we really need is more fidelity, more granularity at the national level to have models that then can be interpreted and applied, even at the community level. And so that modeling isn't there yet in the science. And that's what we're really looking toward. Some of the data does exist, so to the extent that the United States and other countries can share this hydrological data, that's a great step in that direction. And so a research agenda in academia is to improve local modeling for hydrological resources and also for the impacts of climate change. So that's the real need, and that's the real research gap. And so in short, the water picture for the future, 15, 25 years, does not look good. It's extremely doubtful that the commitments in Paris, I haven't read the newspaper yet today, but it's extremely doubtful that the warming will be held to within 2 degrees Celsius. It's extremely doubtful, unfortunately, that world global temperatures will be held to within 4 degrees Celsius. And so even if we went down to 0 carbon emissions today, the latency of fixing the problem would take about 30 years. So all the work we're looking at is what's going to happen in the next 30 years. And within the context of that, it's the Middle East and North Africa that will experience the worst of it, but then there are these other regions, especially regions that are fed by fresh water from glaciers, that really need to be looked at. And you can't look at these issues in isolation because it is, again, the linkages with other sectors between energy, food production, and water scarcity. So any of the community level solutions, any of the global solutions that support decision making will have to take all these sectors into account. And building resilience and mitigating conflict is a really community level endeavor, and so we have to get the data both on the social science side and the physical science side down to that community level and provide it to the people that need it most. So that's the challenge that's currently most salient in this field. So thank you for your time.